Hey, Ilyas, thank you for coming in. I mean, Quantinuum, what? You're the largest integrated quantum computing company in the world. You just completed, just a few months ago, a $600 million funding round and listen to this through the audience, 10 billion valuation, right? And you had JP Morgan again, and they were the lead back in January of 2024. And course, JP Morgan overall has come out publicly committing 1.5 trillion. So you've got really one of the foremost banks in the world backing you. And I know in your release you indicated that they're trying some complex financial modeling, things like that. So they've been way out there. But just remarkable the journey you're on. And so what I want to do during this interview, and this is our fourth, is to kind of pick up where we left off. So the last interview we did, I guess you had already completed a $300 million equity round of 5 billion pre, and that was led by JP Morgan. You had Mitsui, Amgen, and Honeywell participating. So really some remarkable bets. And that was basically aimed to accelerate due to fault tolerance. I know you had the wiring problem solved for scaling with your QCCD technologies, and I think that's really interesting because scaling is an important part. You announced your milestones. You had your 800 times speed up and fault tolerance, things like that, or like error correction. You had the Microsoft Continuum Logical Qubit milestone, right? So like 800 times better, zero errors, and 14,000 trials. I mean, it's just remarkable. And then, of course, you start. So Let's start iterating from there. So I think that was about May of 2024. So that's kind of the setup. And I know, and for the audience who don't recall or haven't looked at your company, you were the merger between Honeywell and Cambridge. Quantum, and that's where you created the world's largest sort of integrated quantum computing company. And you've been milestone after milestone after milestone, right? So if you can kind of step us through from, let's say, May roughly of last year to your recent announcement with Helios, and everybody just can't wait for Sol and Apollo, right?
Oh, thank you. It's good to be back, and you've certainly captured in a couple of sentences what we often struggle to capture in a whole paragraph or a page. It is sometimes difficult, but I do think that it is now finally possible to start to simplify, and people are beginning to focus less on the what the hell's going on underneath. Like our early conversations were, what is a quantum computer? Why does it?
That's, that's true.
Which reminds me of what the hell's a neural network and what's a large language model. Whereas in AI, of course, now everybody's focused on the things that really do matter. Um, so to take it from the top, yeah, we you may not have noted we actually raised close to 850. So we ended up with a round of over 800 million that we've completed. And our new investors in this round who've joined the existing investors who all followed on means that our share register as a private company is something that as a founder, as a spokesperson, obviously as a shareholder myself, I really take great pride in. And I think that Nvidia joining this round and Fidelity joining this round and Quanta joining this round, alongside, as you say, JP Morgan, who've invested from their balance sheet, Amgen, who've invested as well, Honeywell, of course, my own company, Cambridge Quantum Holdings, has invested again. And there's a really very nice validation that is this long thread that joins successful companies going back over now many, many decades, which is that if you have large, important shareholders, and these shareholders have proximity to what you do,
Yeah, for sure.
then you really have nowhere to hide.
That's
So
true.
you don't get away with some sort of bland statements that might get a few retail investors excited, right? And that is who we are. We say we do. We say we do. And I think that's the first point I would make. This validation, if you like, the valuation, the amount of money we've raised, the kind of people who've invested in us, the kind of people who continue to invest in us. I think that that's something which is only possible when you are transparent, when you are consistent, when you meet your milestones. In terms of the milestones that matter, maybe I'll just focus on a couple of them. I think that the single most important point is that Helios is the first of its kind. There's literally nothing else on the planet that comes close. My CEO was last week in a public meeting in New York, and he said we're 3 to 4 years ahead of the competition. I think he's right. I think some of our competition we're probably a decade ahead of. Some of the competition, maybe not 4 years, maybe close to 3 years or 2.5. Time will tell. But the good thing is that we now have a benchmark. Helios is currently the only integrated quantum computing company. There are different bits of what you and I recognize as integrated. If I showed you this baby here, nobody would disagree that it's integrated. So, how close are we to the classical definition of integration? Well, in Helios, we're finally there. So that's one milestone. The other milestone is that Helios is commercially available and all of its performances are validated by external validators who are national labs. So we're no longer doing these arcane experiments and saying, hey, didn't we do well? But then, of course, we have to scale it. So we've left that in the rearview mirror, which I think is really, really important. Then the other milestone, which I think you've very nicely encapsulated, is that other people now really care. So the constituency of people that care has grown. And you and I have talked about this before, but every nation state of consequence, every country of consequence has a quantum computing program. And in Helios, they now have a benchmark. So when public money is being spent, people can say, what is the state of the art? Okay. And that I think is really important, particularly for and I'm biased here, and I'll make this my last point because there are a couple of technical ones that you might want to dive more into. So the high temperature superconductivity, for example, or the error correction, for example, what we did with JP Morgan. So we can come back to that. But just finishing on this point, I think that the days when public money was spent on experimental machines that are maybe pump priming, that tipping point to where we're now looking at commercial capital, looking for commercial advantage, is starting to happen. And the last time this happened in an industry was before your and my time. It was the semiconductor industry. It was way back in the 60s and the 70s. So the pump priming was state funding, public funding. Tipping point came, and then commercialization took over. And that's what I think this year, 2025, and particularly Helios, signals.
It's interesting. You mentioned the semiconductor industry, and I actually remember that. When we went from transistors and from the early 60s, and then we went to integrated circuits, right? And then we went to CMOS and things like that from the end of the 70s and 80s.
Mm.
And even Intel going from a 4004 to an 888, and then you see things really taking off, right? And the Z80 and so on. So you're right. Yeah, we're at a launch point, but you're really leading the charge and just an amazing visionary. You kind of jumped directly, and we skipped some of sort of the milestones leading up to. But you know what, Helios is like you said, it's like a new era, right? And it's now your journey towards Apollo, and then going forward, and you're showing the hallmarks of commercialization. As you mentioned, you got Helios commercially launched, right? You can have it on premise, you can have it in the cloud. I think it was really interesting that Singapore, you've got this research agreement and partnership with Singapore, and that's a significant milestone. But you also have SoftBank as well. And so, can you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, Amgen invested, but they're also one of the leading kind of biotech companies out there. You got JP Morgan, but they're a leading financial services. You said Fidelity was in there as well, and Nvidia. It's interesting. Jensen, maybe last year, got into a little bit of trouble, or maybe not trouble, but he was saying, "Oh, it's way off," and then he completely switched and said, "No, I mean, I was wrong," and now he's doubling down. So there's a lot of things we can talk about because you're integrated with NVQ Link. You were part of that announcement.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
of course, Q to Q, which is part of the Nvidia sort of milestones as well. And you got Guppy. So let's kind of then, since we're sort of focusing on this commercial Helios milestone, let's focus more on the details of what that means, right? Like you got a 2-to-1 physical to logical qubit count. Why does that matter? You got, like 4 nines on one qubit. Why does that matter? You got 3 nines, 2-bit qubit.
Yeah.
Why does that matter? You got Guppy.
That's
Why
right.
does that matter, right? So,
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Extremely easy to jump about and skip. So I just want to make a non sort of interview conversation point with you, Stephen. I think I like I mean, I get to speak to a lot of people, do a lot of events. But I really like speaking to somebody who's got that perspective, who actually remembers what was said and done in 2017 and 2019 and 2021. And I would simply say that our milestones that we have achieved in the last year have met or exceeded everything we said we would do.
yeah,
And the
it's
reason that
remarkable,
that's important is that it breeds trust, of course, but it also
right?
allows us to deliver Helios. So if we zero in on the solving of the wiring problem, i.e., how can you prove that you can scale this technology?
Right,
That was important because the traditional view, and I can't blame people, from about 2015-ish until about 2024-ish, was that trapped ions are wonderful, they're stable, but oh my God, how are you going to scale? Right.
right,
So that used to be, and of course, that is no more the case. So proving that you can scale and converting a science problem into an engineering problem is one part of the milestones that we can list them again. But if you aggregate them, you'd say that is one part, and that is maybe half of the milestones. The other half are, okay, so what about the time to solution? Trapped ions are really good. Other types of qubits are good as well, but they're a little bit slower. And a little bit slower once you're starting to do hundreds, thousands, hundreds of thousands of circuits, then you end up having a solution that you and I, as human beings, we can't see. We don't know what the solution is because we haven't, got the readout. So I think the other sort of, I would say 30 to 40% of our accomplishment in the last year and a half, which we were confident about, but now we've shown, is that there is no difference in time to solution of the fastest two or three alternatives. So the superconducting guys, and obviously the trapped ion guys, and to a certain extent, the neutral atom guys. I mean, the new platinum guys haven't yet got the proof points, and I'm sure that at some point they will. But these are the three methodologies that are predominant as far as the choice is concerned. So that would be the sort of the second aggregator of all of the milestones. And lastly, and rightly, why does that matter in the real world? So our ability to convert some sort of a concatenation of those technologies into an application doesn't happen until you have the integrated software. And this is something that quite a lot of people have picked up on. I'm very pleased. Scott Aronson picked up on it today as well. You and I interact with, shall we say, ChatGPT. We're not computer scientists, let's say, where some, housewife who wants to understand why a brown egg is better than a white egg, right? So she interacts and she uses language that is natural to her, and she doesn't have a white lab coat, she doesn't have a PhD, but she gets the answer. That's what the other bits of what we've done here, Guppy and Selene, obviously the whole software stack from the metal to the user, and that I think is big for the industry. It accelerates the ecosystem. So I am happy to go through any of the individual ones in there, but I think that's just worth saying. Shall I turn to answering, or not answering, but addressing your query regarding the actual commercialization now? Would that be the right next step?
I mean, I just came back from a private banking event, and there's all sorts of privacy sort of rules around that. But since they published publicly that I was doing it,
Right,
but the discussion was private, so I can't get into our discussion. And I just completed it yesterday,
right,
or
right, right.
like a day before yesterday, right? So, um, but I can now generalize and saying, in general, because I mean, it's healthcare, they're all interested in, the commercialization aspect, and they're seeing some of the early kind of signals that commercialization is there, right? In fact, before Marco left, he was head of quantum at JP. He went public with a test they did, and they did it on some quantum hardware, and they were able to complete it. It took them something like 3 seconds, and then a classical would take 5 minutes, so it's like 1,000 times speed up. And he went public with it, and that was this year, right? So,
Yes,
and
yes.
and this is in like portfolio optimization or things like that. So, there's a lot of kind of interest or in healthcare as well. Just a tremendous amount of excitement. So, yeah, why? I mean, because you are there, right? You have the ability now to start getting into the commercial aspects and then
Yeah,
expanding
yeah.
and scaling, right? So,
Yeah, I would go one step further. I think at the moment, well, we're the first to have a portfolio of commercial customers. I think many of my colleagues in this industry do have research projects with customers, but I think we're the first to have a true portfolio. And BMW, Amgen, obviously, JP Morgan, SoftBank, Government of Singapore, our colleagues and customers and partners in places such as Qatar and the United Kingdom. We went public.
Japan, right?
Japan, of course, yes. And thank you for reminding me. I was going to say also, interestingly, my favorite topic, which I hope we get a chance to talk about, biology, genomics. We have a project with Sanger. So that portfolio is interesting, but the foundational bit, which you're asking about, let me address that very quickly. And this will be familiar to anybody who has listened to your and my conversation in the past. There's a bucket of experiments which are designed to show that what theoretically was mooted to be um, possible with quantum, because quantum has advantages, is now actual. So these are naturally quantum advantageous. These are quantum problems that Feynman and others said can never be done classically. So these are in that bucket of which physical simulations of systems that are molecular and submolecular or atomic. These are that bucket, and everything accruing from that, essentially material science. Then there's a bucket of things which are classical, where some quantum advantage might be posited using a quantum computer. And that is very hard, very, very, very hard. And as of today, there is no meaningful or credible example that such an advantage is repeatable and commercially viable. There have been a number of things that have been highlighted. I think our friends at IBM did some bosonic sampling or something, and then 4 hours later, somebody a kid on an iPhone says, "Well, I did better," right? And there'll always be this jump. There's a very, very fine example. HSBC just did something as well, similar with, again, with IBM. So, and IBM are known for pushing the envelope on this. It's wonderful work that they do. But these are in areas where really there's not any reason why quantum should naturally be faster, but maybe it could be, right? So there's that. QML is a good example if you want to just look at a bucket of things. I'm optimistic, however, that just as we've seen the proof of quantum advantage for things where quantum computers should be advantageous, we now will start to see advances in this second bucket. We haven't yet. And then the third bucket, which I think becomes really more relevant in this next 2 or 3 years, and I would say 2 years, is this area where you have a classical AI system, maybe some LLM or whatever, and you have this quantum system which generates information that previously wasn't available to the language model because it simply didn't exist. So this is coming out of a quantum computer, and the quantum information might be some ground state energy or something which clearly is physics in nature. And thereby the combination of these systems doing something that neither could do on their own. And I think that there's rightfully a lot of caution about that. I'm actually really excited, and I think we will be showing, and if anybody who follows Quantinuum knows that we will not state that we're going to do something unless we do it. But I believe that in partnership with people like Nvidia and others, that's where we will be showing big breakthroughs in the next 2 or 3 years. So that's the sort of the portfolio of commercialization opportunity and the way in which I'm just going to focus on Amgen, for example. Amgen, oh, and BMW, all right? So Amgen and BMW, these are examples of two organizations who are not naive. They know
For sure.
exactly what can be done classically. They are big users of high performance compute. They are entirely eyes wide open about the current capability. And in both cases, they have the pick of the world. They could go to any organization in the world and say, I want your computer. And both of them have come to us. And that, I think, is a reflection of the fact that both organizations now believe, and their words, not mine, that the addition of a quantum system into their solution architecture will accelerate, or if not accelerate, then create accuracy where previously there was only stochastics available to them for processes that are very important.
There's so many different areas to mine here, right? So things that you said in earlier today, and then you got into the generative side. You get that generative Q AI from what you're doing. You mentioned HSBC, and they got a 34% boost in their bond filling quoting kind of capability, and that was announced this year, right? So, but HSBC also did on their digital bond Orion, I guess it's the Orion platform. They did PQC, post quantum cryptography, but they had your Quantinuum. I believe I'm pretty sure you're the only certified real quantum random number generator facility, right? And that's a milestone, especially when you're doing things like Monte Carlo or other kind or cryptography in general, right? Because that hasn't been achieved and been certified. And at least the last time I checked, you were the only one in the world that has received certification. Maybe there's others now, but
Yeah, I think that this is very interesting. This is one of those areas where in years to come, maybe not that many years to come, but in a year or two to come, people will look back and say, why was there even any debate? So the world is full of people that supply quantum randomness. It is true, and they're very fine organizations. And what they do is they harvest entropy. And it's a bit like in the old days, Stephen, you'd say, well, how many snowflakes have fallen if it's snowing in Reykjavik and in this, square mile? Of course, nobody knows, but if you were able to count them and then you were able to somehow create some sort of unbreakable pattern of counting them, then that would never be replicated. So that would be a one-off, and that would therefore be a secret between you and I that could be a key. So that would be randomness. So there are many people who mine entropy at the atomic level, at the quantum level, and that's great. And some of them are device dependent. We're the only people that are doing what Einstein calls, this sort of entanglement-based spooky action, from which you can then derive, as you know, the Bell test or the Mermin test, and it can't be done any other way. It is quantum, it is maximally random, and there's no argument about it. So not only are we the only ones doing it at the moment, so A, we're the only ones doing it. B, we're the only ones doing it that is certified. And I think that the world will move to a place where this is so normal that the seed, the entropy seed, will have to be entanglement-based random entropy. Anything that is just a scatter of things that are hard to replicate will no longer be fit for purpose in the future. It's a bit like having these car, seat belts. There was a time when it was a choice. Now you and I get in a car, we don't imagine not using a seatbelt. So in the future, nobody will imagine using entropy that isn't entanglement based and therefore maximal. So I'm very, very pleased by this, but this is one of the rising tides over the course of the next few years that will engulf the whole randomness area. Scott Aronson speaks about this very, very well. The challenge, let's just talk about the challenge at the moment. What are the challenges there for this to be commercially, globally applicable? One is verifiability. So how would you know that I'm not cheating you, that actually I don't really have a quantum computer generating entangled pairs? I'm just kind of making it up. And that, depending on who you are and where you are, you really don't want to be dependent on my word. And you also don't want to be dependent on a machine that's a black box, right? These quantum computers, you have no idea what's going on under the hood. So the verifiability is and the speed of verifiability and the cost of verifiability, and this thing called cross entropy benchmarking, which you will have come across in the post. This is where a lot of attention is now being paid. And this is an engineering issue. This is not a science issue. We've now solved the science. And when I say 2 or 3 years' time, that's, I think, what will allow us to become completely commercially acceptable. And the first step in that journey was allowing a user to implement the Bell test themselves. So 3, 4, 5 steps still to go before we get to this universality, unless you're a very large customer and you don't have to worry about this and you just buy the quantum computer, and then you are as sure as anybody ever will be that you are generating maximal randomness because this is exploiting entanglement. So that's a lot to digest there, but that I think is just on that particular topic, which will get a lot of airtime, I think. At the moment, it's not getting any airtime, but it will get more and more airtime in the coming years.
So let's kind of summarize here, right? I mean, you're the first one out. I believe it's NIST that certified you. There's only, and I could be wrong, but there's a very prestigious, globally renowned organization known for standards. They're known for releasing the 3 post-quantum cryptography standards. They certified you. I mean, you got a third party, reputable body that's globally famous over decades saying you are truly random, right? So that eliminates all of the crosstalk. You got verification. You got HSBC and their tokenized gold offer. That's a commercial application, their test. They used you, right, to show that it could work in a commercial application. So there you go, right? And so now, so let's take out all of the noise and just say you got commercial proof, you got third party, proof as well, verification, ratifying that what you got, and it's usable and it's going to protect things in a way that no other system can do. You need fully randomness, and that's why HSBC did this tokenized test, and it succeeded. And they used you as part of that test, which means they can expand it to their whole digital platform, right? And earlier in last year, they actually got the government to do multiple listings of their new currency offering on their platform, but then they decide to test on the tokenized gold side, which is actually a retail commercial product. It's a retail and institutional investor product. And then they said, let's see if we can test post-quantum cryptography. That what to the audience, that means that there's this idea that quantum can break encryption, and we won't get into all the details, but everybody agrees it's going to happen. And so you need some kind of protection, right? And so there's a lot of movement globally. HSBC is one of them testing. JP Morgan is testing. Toshiba's a big part of this because they got sort of the algorithms on the fiber that could work with this. So there's Abyss, the Bank of International Settlements, is in phase 2 of their testing with Mexico and with SWIFT and with three central banks. But a critical part of all of this kind of coming together is they need randomness, and you're the only one that has it. So that's a big
Yeah,
deal.
yeah. Well, the picks and shovels argument works here, definitely. We're very, yeah, we're very excited about being able to do that sort of that essential first step where the seed is maximally random according to nature. I do think I just want to temper the one aspect of this. I think globally commercializing this will require one or two or three more steps, but they will happen. And I think this idea that somehow it can be easily managed if you had a parallel or a alternative source of randomness that was kind of quantum but isn't. I think that's where the user adoption will have a tipping point that hasn't yet happened. I think, Stephen, many organizations, including BISS and others, when they look at the seeding of these cryptographic methodologies where only quantum should work, I think that tipping point that says, well, what we've got kind of works, it's okay, what you're doing is really nice, but I really don't want to implement across the board. I think that point in time is now approaching rather rapidly, but it's still a year or two, or maybe three away. That's my only temper on what you've said.
Yeah, but you laid the groundwork. It's just like the original transistors laid the groundwork for the initial integrated circuits. We laid the groundwork for CMOS, right? Which laid the groundwork where like deep, large scale integrated systems, and it's laid the groundwork. It's like John Hennessy laid the groundwork for risk architecture, which is everywhere today, right?
Those are big, those are big shoes to fill. Yeah, I agree. I think that the bigger, and if I may, I think the bigger groundwork in terms of societal impact is this inclusion of Guppy with Helios and the whole sort of platform that means that essentially anybody can approach a quantum computer and run or design applications without needing to be a quantum computing information theorist. That abstraction, I mean, it's really weird. I'm kind of pushing back on it. I would say that's the bigger milestone achievement in terms of their before and after that we are responsible for the entire ecosystem. And that's where Nvidia gets excited. That's where SoftBank gets excited. That's where Amgen gets excited. And I want to just drop that in. If we're going to go to the greats and the gods, Hennessy Excel,
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. In fact, I've been doing back-to-back private events, and they're all sea level, like, there's sovereign fund people in there, there's CEOs and investors. And the big question comes up is they always think, well, I have to be a physicist. And what's
Mm.
the meta layer? It's like you and I are old enough. We remember we had to write drivers and kind of work at the bind, or at least I did. I had to work at bits and even flick switches and things to program. And then you got assembler, which made it easier. And then you got languages like BASIC and Fortran made it easier. And now you got Python and things like that. You add these layers that simplify everything. And I get this question all the time. When is this layer going to appear with the quantum hardware providers so that you don't have to understand cost Hamiltonian sort of modeling or QUBO for annealers or Ising models for annealers and things like that. So you don't have to get into all of that feature, all of that complexity. I know there's startups like Classique can act as a bit of an in-between. You could do simulators like Penny Lane out of Xanadu and stuff like that. But you got something that's tied directly to your hardware stack, right? And then it integrates with NVQ link and Q2Q and things like that. So maybe so you just mentioning Guppy, you just answered the whole years of questions of when is this thing coming out? So maybe you can get a little bit more detail about what that means and
Yeah,
how does that make a difference with the announcement you did with Nvidia just a few days ago? Huge announcement,
yeah,
right? And
yeah.
you're part of that announcement, MVQ Link and Q2Q. Q2Q's been out for a while, but MVQ Link and how does that tie in with Guppy and how does that make everything just better, right? Easier and better, right? And help with error correction because ultimately we're in this scenario. It used to be that quantum computers are noisy, intermediate, and then now error correction is being applied, right? You can apply error and you can apply errors fast or error correction faster than the errors. Then you get this idea of logical qubits and fault tolerance. So now you can get production quality work, utility scale, and then advantage. So you're part of that journey. You're leading part of that journey. For the audience out there, maybe you can explain in a little bit more detail how this all integrates, right? So,
Yeah, so I'm very mindful of the audience being largely non-quantum technical, but possibly also largely non-CS technical. So it's very difficult sometimes talking to knowledgeable people not to get a little bit overtly technical. So I would give you I'll do two bits. One is on Guppy and what it really does, and why that matters, and then I'll come back to QEC, which is vitally important. So Guppy is the equivalent, and I'm borrowing this terminology from Scott Aronson, who is a commentator, but also a
okay, let
highly
me intercede though. Scott Harrison is considered one of the preeminent theorists in this area, right? I've interviewed him, and he's kind of like, because I'm part of ACM or a computer science organization. So when you mention Scott, he's like, it's Scott, right? So
Oh
it's
no,
like John Hennessy of Alphabet, right?
he's a demigod. I mean, in
Yeah.
this and he's earned the right because he's determinedly objective.
Yeah, that's true. Often
Uh,
critical, by the way.
yeah, yeah, and yeah, friend or foe, it doesn't matter. He's determinedly objective, but he's qualified.
Yeah, for sure.
Pulling the wool over his eyes. He understands exactly what's going on. Yeah, so he came up with this terminology. Others may have done already, but he came up with this terminology, and it was like he said, just-in-time programming. So up until now, we've had to design our circuits and then we implement them, and then we only find out afterwards whether something worked or it didn't work. And that actually was the equivalent of the old programming. As you're smiling, you know exactly what I mean here. So there's nothing more desirable in the development of programs for solving problems using a quantum computer. There's nothing more desirable to have that fully integrated flexibility so that you have quote unquote just in time programming. So you fix, and then you have the whole as opposed to build the whole, lift it, take it over here, gingerly put it down, press a button, and the whole bloody thing collapses. And then you have to figure out where it collapsed, right? So that is a fundamental fix. There's no overstating this. And by the
Yeah.
way, it did not exist in any way, shape, or form in the industry. There are small elements where on little tiny simulators you could go off and do this, but at a commercial level at impact, this is a major change. Guppy it's a programming language, it's quantum native, and it's not only a programming language, it is an integrated platform that allows all the things that you mentioned to happen. And the reason why they can happen is that you have this so-called just-in-time programming. So that's Guppy. I mean, we could spend an hour on Guppy or more, but that's the impact of Guppy.
Why
And
did you call it Guppy?
oh, it actually, there's a couple of videos in LinkedIn as well. The programming team came up with it. It actually wasn't something that they said, oh, we should have Guppy. Guppy, the individual letters stand for something, generalized user, something programming, and the generalization being the equivalent of what you said about abstraction. And then, of course, there's a Zen element to this because fish, coming around, little koan, Koan, so that just stuck. And so the logo that the team used, I've got one here. You guys probably can't see it, but the
Yeah,
Guppy
yeah, we could see it.
fish, it's a little curled fish. Yeah, then on error correcting, there's nothing at the moment more important. I get the fact that people who are still in pre-first generation and first generation platforms, they will say, well, if you get the qubit quality right, then you don't need error correction. And that is true in experimental cases, but the qubit quality, physical qubit quality is pre-error correction. Even if you do one or two shots at 4 nines or 5 or 6, you cannot program. You've got to have literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of circuit depths or depths of circuit, i.e., actual different operations that are being implemented. And for that, error-corrected qubits are the only way we're going to achieve universal fault tolerance in the short and medium term. There's a hero shot, as you know, or what do you call it, a Hail Mary shot, that topological quantum computing might come to pass in the future. I think Microsoft and we are the only two that are seriously looking at that. But the world can't wait for the 5 or 10 years that might take. So in the quality of our qubits allows us now to do stuff that matters. You asked me a specific question. We are lucky to have one of the largest error correcting teams on the planet. We're lucky that they have access to the metal, so it's not just theory. And we're lucky that we take seriously our milestone obligations. And Helios has given us a shot at delivering to the world in a very short space of time. The next generation is called Sol, 100 logical qubits that, I think there's this fantastic note done by Microsoft, some blog they did last year, which I like. It said, 50 is a tipping point, and we now have the 50. Nobody else has anything like what we've got. I'm not talking about GHZ states or some sort of non-programmable instance. Um, and moving from 50 to 100 now for us is purely mechanical. Others will seek to get from 1 to 5 to 10 to 50. We've now going from 50 to the next level. That's why this is so important. And remember when I talked about this sort of a holy trinity, I didn't use that language, but a code LLM or an LLM, a strong GPU cluster, and a quantum computer working in tandem to do things that any of them on their own couldn't. I think that tipping point for commercialization is in fact 100 logical qubits. And we will be the first to get there years before anybody else. And that really is why I think people are beginning to sit up and take note.
Yeah, and in fact, again, in my series of private keynotes and things like that, I've been saying that, people want a simple number that they can track. So I've been indicating 100 logical. It's kind of like kind of a milestone. You do see really all the major, whether it's neutral atom or superconducting or even cat qubits. I mean, within the superconducting, you're seeing all of them kind of converging to this 100 number, right? Where they can say, okay, we got utility scale and then maybe moments of advantage, right? So to the audience, utility is where you're faster, stronger, better. And then advantage is you're all of that. And maybe you could do things that, or not maybe you could do things that classical cannot do, right? But 100 is that kind of milestone, and you're leading to that, right?
I think 50 or so. Yeah, this is a really good point, and you're so right. We do not yet have in our industry a fair way, like a language that is usable across all modalities and all companies, and that can act as the differentiator, so that when you and I go and buy a car, we can make our choice. Um, Whereas here we're not there yet. I would imagine that logical qubits will end up being, that sort of differentiator and that standard. I think 50, Stephen, is where classical doesn't compete. 50, 55, 60. Logical qubits, all of them working consistently all the time at 4 nines or better. In our case, it'll be better, or it is better. 100 is where then not only can a classical computer not compete in things that are just theoretical, but where you start to get commercial advantage if you can really boost that power. And I'll give you one example of why classical matters, why Nvidia matters, for example, and why organizations such as Oracle will matter. And they're not the only two. I don't want to just focus on those two, but classical high performance compute will matter because QEC in quantum error correcting, we need a powerful high performance compute to enable us to do the things we're doing to program, if you like, our quantum computer. This is beyond human endeavor. This is not about three or four clever people sitting there and solving with code that comes to them in a dream. This is not a Ramanujan type thing. So that's what I would say on that. I'm mindful we're coming to the end of our time, but we could maybe in a year or less time, when we've achieved the next milestones on QEC, you and I could have just a QEC conversation, if you want, because that would be quite interesting.
Well, you're already okay. So just to the audience, and as you mentioned, we're down to our last few minutes, and it feels like we're just starting. There's so many different areas, but I just want to kind of talk about some of the notable items, right? You cross the barrier of kind of scaling on the like on the individual components, and you got a way of scaling, and you got a way of having reliability, and fidelity is a measure of this kind of reliability, right? And you got and 4 nines, you got 4 9 state preparation. That's a really great measure of reliability. You got uh,
Out of the lab. Doing it in a lab and posting an archive paper is not the same as doing it in a big commercial system. I want to say, there are other organizations that may have either corroborated or not corroborated, but at least claimed 4 nines in some sort of laboratory environment. That in itself, Stephen, if I gave you enough money and some good postdocs, you could do that in a few months. But doing it repeatedly, like when you start your car, it works. When you put on your iPhone, it works all the time. That repeatability is what we did, as opposed to just because our 4 nines is years old. We did 4 nines without telling anybody. We didn't feel it was important to make a big deal of it.
yeah, the consistency and the fact that you can maintain these kinds of operations is really noteworthy of what you're doing. You got 4 nines and 1 qubit gate fidelity, and you got 2 nines at to 2 qubit fidelity. You got Error 48 error corrected logical qubit 2-to-1 ratio, which is just remarkable, right? You definitely have the right partners, as you indicated, Amgen, BMW, JP Morgan, SoftBank, Nvidia. You've got Riken in Japan. I mean, you're everywhere now, and they're looking at not just theory, they're looking at how can we move this into practical application, both in the scientific area and then also on the commercialization side. So you're already in the middle of that. You mentioned that, and I get this question all the time. Where's that kind of the meta layer? You got it, Guppy, right? You got the full stack with Lean and Guppy and things like that. So you've addressed that so that people can do the commercialization side. You did this recent announcement with Nvidia, and Nvidia
Yeah,
invested as well.
Hugger, Guppy, Celine. That's the Trinity.
Yeah, and then you got
Yeah.
NVQ link and Q2Q, which are helping the orchestration side with GPUs. And because the reality is that quantum is like an accelerator. So you're going to have classical working with quantum, working with AI, and you got this generative Q AI as well, which is kind of
Which, by
unique.
the way, that terminology we invented, I'm very proud of this. I'm not naming conventions, but generative QAI, Gen QAI, that term didn't exist until we announced it this time last year. So I'm really actually quite proud of that as well. I hope that that becomes de rigueur.
Okay, so you got a minute, and then I'm going to ask for a closing. Um, for the audience, why is generative QAI important?
It's important because it allows us to move beyond the theory that a quantum computer and for example, Nvidia core can solve problems that previously were unsolvable. It gets to the point where we can then start to build commercial applications on those scientific breakthroughs. So when Jensen talks about Nvidia and Quantinuum working together to create solutions, what he's saying is that those scientific primitives are going to become programmable. And then once they're programmable, you can build the application. Are we a year away or are we 5 years away? In some big GPT moment, Gen QAI GPT moment, I don't know, but it's certainly I think it'll be earlier than 5 years. It might even be 2 years. That's why that's important. Because a quantum computer on its own, with all due respect to all of our competitors, will not move the needle commercially day to day. Um, I think in that same time frame aligned with GPUs or high performance compute, both for quantum error correction and for this Gen QAI. That's where the magic happens.
Yeah, and in fact, that's the noteworthiness of this new open architecture, the MVQ link and the Q2Q, because that's helping with the
Correct.
orchestration, the classical, the error
Yes.
correction as well, and it's real time, right? Real time compilation, decoding,
Yeah,
and things
that's
like
the
that.
so the just in time thing that Scott said.
Yeah.
You can actually be effective.
And you also, just a few days ago, you made stage B of the DARPA Quantum Benchmarking Initiative. Again, a great accomplishment. I'm pretty sure you're going to go to stage C. I'm absolutely sure of that. So just remarkable. You got 1 minute. What would you like to say in closing?
I would like to say that something very simple. I think that when Stephen Hawking thought about quantum computers, he thought about the fact that they would help us to solve the most intractable problems in the most intractable subject, which is biology. I've talked about this before. 19th century was about chemistry. The 20th was about physics. The 21st is about biology. And I really, really can't emphasize enough how important the societal impact will be of the stuff that we're doing in quantum because of the impact on solving the really important issues, whether it's photosynthesis, whether it's genomics, whether it's nitrogen fixation, which is not quite biology, but nevertheless, it's those areas that excite me, and I remind people that that's why quantum matters.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You mentioned Stephen Hawkins. You were the chair of his Stephen Hawkins Foundation Institute, something like that, right? So Anyways, Ilyas, I always enjoy our time together. This is our fourth interview. As you cross more milestones, hopefully you will grant me some more interviews. So thank you again for coming in. I just enjoyed our time together. So
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.